Let me begin by offering a disclaimer of sorts. So this isn't quite my first speaking engagement post-COVID, but many of these thoughts are potentially symptomatic of COVID-induced isolation. So you will be my first test audience for what I'm about to present here today. So I do reserve the right to contradict myself and abandon or disavow any of these views, even by the time I reach the end of my slides. That said, these are two issues that are very near and dear to me. And I think anybody who engages with the terrorism problem, whether you are a student, a researcher, academic, a practitioner, you are inevitably going to have to deal with these issues. You're going to have to figure out what motivation is. You're going to have to figure out how you approach motivation, how you think of it, how you place it into the work that you do. Now, depending on whether you're a practitioner or an academic, you might have wildly divergent needs and responsibilities around that issue. Closely related to it is this very thorny, and I think increasingly thorny, issue of ideology. And these are obviously related but distinct issues. This is my 25th year as a researcher of terrorism, and I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that I don't think we're getting anywhere as far as cracking the motivation question is concerned. Now, what that means is another issue, and I'm prepared to follow this insane logic through to its conclusion, but I don't think we're getting anywhere with it. I think the issue of motivation is forever likely to be an issue of subjective interpretation. We can all look at the same case and we can all come up with, we might have broadly similar interpretations, but as to this issue of what drives someone to do what they do, I don't think we're going to get anywhere under our current paradigms. The second issue, the second related point that I'm going to drive even further into this today and over the next few days is this issue of ideology. I think we have both misunderstood and overstated the role of ideology as a driving force in terrorism. Now, I realize, and I would be the first person to admit that that seems like a rather strange thing to say. I promise I'm not just adopting a contrarian view just for the sake of it, because after all, what is terrorism if not an ideological activity? So how can we say on the one hand, this is an ideological activity, and yet ideology doesn't seem to matter as much for its participants? Well, I'm going to try to reconcile those two views. And I'm going to dive even further into this, especially with my practitioner friends today and tomorrow and Wednesday, to say that if your job, if your role is in primary prevention, I really don't think getting wrapped up in convoluted questions about ideology is going to do you any favors whatsoever. I am genuinely coming to the view that we could be talking about ideology and talking about fluid ideologies until kingdom come, and it won't make a blind bit of difference in terms of making you more effective at primary prevention. There's so much that we can do in primary prevention, and there's so much by way of promising practices that are really revealing some very exciting developments. But ideology is not necessarily part of that. Now, if your bag is what we call tertiary prevention, I'm not sure if we're really using the term de-radicalization anymore, but it's a useful shorthand, then it's a different issue. Then it can matter, then it does matter, then it probably should matter in terms of issues around risk assessment. But for primary prevention, I am increasingly thinking it might actually be a red herring. So, to unpack this just a little bit further, these are the three concerns that have really, I think, begun to converge for me in recent years. The first is something that I'm probably preaching to the choir when I say this, but the expanding complexity and diversity of terrorist actors. Diversity and complexity are two of the defining features of terrorism. The low base rate is probably the third one, but diversity and complexity are right up there. That is either expanding or increasing, or it appears to be increasing or expanding. The second issue is that as I said at the beginning, I contend that we have absolutely failed to talk about and think about motivation in a way that is coherent and useful. Now, it might be that I'm trying to have my cake and eat it today. I mean, I'm going to stop short at suggesting we completely abandon the search for motivation, but I am going to say that if we want to keep it, then we need to reframe it, and we need to urgently reframe it and talk about it in more operationally useful ways. And the third issue, which is it's a little narrower, I admit, and it's probably closer to my own selfish interest as a psychologist, but I think we have also failed to really capitalize on what psychology can offer here. We still don't have enough people doing psychological research on terrorism, and despite the fact that it is, again, by its nature, this is an interdisciplinary subject of study, psychology continues to lag way, way, way behind in terms of what it can potentially offer all of us. So this is going to be a story in 3 parts, and I hope to, if not convince you, then at least to sow some thoughts. Now, again, what I have to say to you this morning might take on a different tinge, might take on different significance depending on what it is you do and what it is that you are interested in. I think there are some rather needless distinctions between academics and practitioners. I think some of the greatest achievements we've seen in terrorism studies over the past 20 years have been from the synergies that academics and practitioners can develop. But again, when it comes to prevention, we're talking about important distinctions here. So let's begin with part 1. And I should probably, now might be a good time to actually say something positive. I'm not trying to come in here and be deliberately negative from the outset here, but we really, really need to acknowledge just how positive and encouraging terrorism research is today. An area that was once just, a fringe interest of equally fringe scholars is now something that commands widespread, sustained interest and attention. It used to be the case that some of the bottlenecks in terrorism research had to do with, well, there's not enough data available, we're not seeing enough rigor by way of studies. All of those issues and more are now moot. They're an issue of historical interest more than anything else. And I think for me, one of the biggest bottlenecks has always been at the graduate, postgraduate level, where I think we never really saw quite enough investment at that level. And again, as someone who is not just interested in doing research, but has an interest in promoting research and promoting the development of our fields, I see some of the most exciting progress being made at the graduate level today. Master's and PhD students doing things that 20 years ago, we really wouldn't have even dreamed of. So the field is thriving. It is in a very good way. And I have to say the future is bright. Again, I will own the fact that I might be preaching to the choir when I say this, but what I really want to drive home is that we shouldn't take that for granted. Most of you are not old enough to have been doing terrorism research 10, 15, 20 years ago, where we would bemoan the fact that things were in a bad way because we just didn't even have the researchers. Now, how significantly all of that has changed. It's probably pointing out the obvious one last time to say that terrorism is diverse. Men, women, children from all different kinds of backgrounds for different sorts of reasons get involved in terrorism through lots of different mechanisms, lots of different combinations of reasons, and they end up doing different kinds of things. If nothing else, terrorism is a strategy that is open and attractive to a wide range of individuals and groups for all manner of purposes. Whether we have fully grasped the implications of that diversity, I think is one of the challenges for us today. There are also new avenues and new expressions, new outlets for newer kinds of terrorism. Does anybody recognize who this person is?
Minassian.
Alek Minassian, correct. 23-year-old Canadian, a young Canadian man who is a self-identified incel or involuntary celibate. And Minassian, in April of 2018, rented a truck and drove it on the sidewalk of a busy Toronto, a downtown area, killed 10 people, and another person died soon after. The police interview with Alek Minassian that followed revealed what in my book was clearly an example of terrorism. So if you look at some of what Minassian said in this rather remarkable police interview, by the way, that's a really neat example of how to do one of these. Minassian is basically explaining his grievance. He says, it's basically a movement of angry incels such as myself who are unable to get laid. I know of several other guys over the internet who feel the same way, but they are too cowardly to act on their anger. Minassian goes on, he says, it was time to take action and not just sit on the sidelines and fester in my own sadness. And he concludes, I was thinking that I would inspire future masses to join me in my uprising as well. Now, this was rather strange stuff when we first heard it. And I think the rise of violent incels, I think, has given us all pause for just how much we have, for far too long, ignored the role of misogyny and violent extremism writ large. But one of the things that really struck me around the coverage and reaction to Minassian in particular was what seemed to me to be a contradiction. There is clear evidence of an ideological dimension to his actions, yet a marked reluctance to characterize him as a terrorist. This was different, odd, strange. And the question that it brought up for me is, well, you know, what does this suggest? I mean, is this us being inconsistent and hypocritical in how we talk about terrorism and think about terrorism? One of the things I have really learned from studying terrorism over 25 years is that it always comes back to basics. Are we willing to stand by the definitions we have for what constitutes terrorism, and are we therefore willing to apply these definitions to potential new forms? Minassian's acts seem to me to be rather unusual, of course, but why would we be reluctant to classify him as terrorism because the goals appear strange or odd or unattainable? To me, that has nothing to do with whether we classify him as ideologically motivated. One of the questions that is coming from what I see as increased diversity is terrorism getting more complicated? Or is it that we have perhaps better access to accounts, better access to the kinds of things that a broader array of violent extremists are saying about themselves? Some recent attacks would appear to suggest that this complexity is actually growing. On the left, we have, for example, I'm not going to go through these in great detail because each of these would warrant a case study of their own, but David DePape, who broke into the house of Nancy Pelosi, the US Speaker of the House of Representatives in houses in California. DePape's online activities reveal a adherence to a wide array of conspiracy theories. Everything from the extreme left to the extreme right and everything in between. Pizzagate, Gamergate, misogyny, and so forth. Peyton Gendron who shot up the supermarket in Buffalo, New York, also displayed a number of ideological adherence to a number of ideological leanings. In a public manifesto and a private diary that suggests he was really quite all over the place in terms of different ideas and influences. And more recently, just last month, in fact, two people who were shot dead outside an LGBTQ friendly bar in Bratislava. Again, an attacker displayed a number of different ideological affiliations and affinities. So evidence of multiple overlapping ideologies. The simple question that arises from this is, well, what does it mean? So ideological fluidity is one term. There are other labels here as well, but what does it mean? And is this something that is it actually increasing, or is it that we are just noticing it more? I want to be open to both possible interpretations here. And again, just to be devil's advocate, is this a valid concern, or is it merely a distraction from prevention efforts, and in particular, primary prevention? So first of all, I'm not entirely sure how to talk about it. I'm not suggesting that each of these terms necessarily is describing the same thing, but these are just some of the labels I'm seeing entering this discourse right now. So ideological fluidity, salad bar extremism. I hadn't heard that until I spoke to somebody at DHS just last week. Ideological promiscuity, ideology hopping, or ideology shopping. There are probably more terms as well out there, I don't know, but clearly there are different terms out there to try to make sense of whatever this thing is. Part two. Whenever we talk about terrorist motivation, to me, there are a wide variety of big issues, little issues, public reasons, private reasons that feed any account of why somebody does what they do. The problem that I have, the reservation that I have in discussions around ideology, is this implicit assumption that ideology is some sort of overriding factor. The sense that ideology, because terrorism is an ideological crime, is necessarily more important than any of these other motivational factors. If it is, I would like to see the evidence for it, because I'm just not convinced that it is so far. Patrick Crusius is someone you may be familiar with, so I want to just take a brief foray into an account of motivation that on the surface would appear to be relatively straightforward. Okay, so Patrick Crusius shot up a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in, I believe it was also 2018. And as just before his attack, posted a 4-page brief manifesto onto a 4chan site in which he proclaimed the following. In general, I support the Christchurch shooter and his manifesto. This attack is a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. They are the instigators, not me. I am simply defending my country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by an invasion. There's a bit more in the middle of this, but he finishes this section by saying, my motives for this attack are not at all personal. Now, we don't have time for, I want to leave time for Q&A at the end of this, but if you were in my class, we would pick this apart for the next 20 minutes. But suffice to say, there are some quick observations we can make from an account like this, okay? So first of all, it's not entirely surprising, but he presents his actions as most terrorist offenders do. It's defensive, it's significant, it's important, it matters, it was necessary, and there was a timeliness to it, urgent. We spend so much time being preoccupied with the content of ideologies that I think what really matters far more are some of the qualities of the ideology. And stressing the need to act now as opposed to later is a very important one. He accepts responsibility. I mean, he's telling us, look, I did this, while simultaneously shunning culpability. I did it, and I want you to know that it was me, but you know, it's not my fault. I had to do it. I had no choice. This needed to be done. He's clearly very eager to tell us about his goals because he's pushing this manifesto out. And he's also seemingly curious about presenting his motives in a specific way. My motives are not at all personal. It's a rather strange thing to say. In most interviews with terrorist offenders, certainly ones that I've been privy to, ideological responses tend to be presented first. The personal reasons are very, very relevant, but they tend to fade into significance for the storyteller. There appears to be multiple driving factors in his account, and this is, like I said, this is still only a very and apparently straightforward one. The question that I have when it comes to thinking through what evidence for multiple overlapping ideologies is, perhaps a rather unusual question. Are we starting off from a wrong assumption here? You know, are we assuming that a person should only be influenced by one type of ideology? Because accounts of progression into terrorism make very frequent reference to engaging with different sorts of ideas and wrestling with them and trying to figure them out and figuring out what works. I have nothing but speculation for what I'm about to say right now, but it seems to me, certainly in the case of Peyton Gendron, the Buffalo shooter, who engaged in a wide variety of different sorts of ideas and extremisms, if you like. For him, there was a constant process of conflict that he was engaging in through all of these ideas. It almost seemed as if the attack itself was a way of reducing the dissonance he was experiencing by engaging in all of these different ideologies. I think if fluid ideologies is real, and I think it probably is, I think there may be an unintentional irony in that, because I think there may be some benefits, in fact, in having us recognize that ideology is just not as important as anything else when it comes to motivating a terrorist. If we look at the Bratislava attack, this diversity is just as present. There's a really terrific, albeit very short, report by Hannah Rose for GNet that was published just very, very quickly after the attack itself. But she did a masterful job of putting together a rather interesting case. The manifesto contains, a little bit of everything. Now you might look at it and go, well, it's not necessarily a huge leap between support for Donald Trump versus support for the alt-right, support for anti-Muslim attitudes, and so on and so forth. But clearly an array of different influences. How to make sense of this then? Two very curious things from his manifesto was that he admitted that he engaged with this material from a young age, and that he was probably unable to grasp what it all meant. Didn't stop him from talking the talk. But he says the key issue for him was discovering 8chan. And he says that he was never the same after that. So to ask a rather basic question here, are these really so far apart? Misogyny, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, eco-fascism. We might be tempted to try to find a common thread. I'm not saying this is the common thread, but this might be one example, okay? To figure out, well, is this really about ideology shopping or fluidity, or really is there a potential master narrative that is underpinning all of this? Maybe, maybe not. But why the assumption of a master narrative or an underlying narrative as opposed to this is the kind of thing that will almost inevitably pull you in if you spend time on 8chan? So might we be better off looking at some of the affordances that the structure of 8chan offers to people who spend time in it, in a space where it really is not that difficult to be exposed to these different sorts of ideas. Or perhaps it's even more broader than that again. But the real risk factor at play here is spending 8 or 10 hours a day online. So again, where do we draw that line? So let me try to pull this together to make it a little bit more concrete. So one of my starting concerns here is that as terrorism seems to be getting more complex, seems to be increasing in its diversity, our ability to decipher motivation appears to be decreasing. Or perhaps we're just realizing how difficult it always has been, and now it's just, there's no hiding behind anything, right? I'm starting to really succumb is not the right word, but nor do I mean to sound defeated here, but I really do think this is forever going to be an issue of subjective interpretation. I cannot see how we dig our way out of this. And the question that I want to pose for the third and final section is, what, if anything, do we lose if we said, you know what, why don't we stop looking for, why do we stop trying to answer the motivation question altogether? Because it seems to me that figuring out if an actor is ideologically influenced is far more important than figuring out what particular ideology is influencing them. Now, again, I don't want to overlook the obvious. I have someone standing here saying, yeah, let's abandon motivation. Let's forget about it. Well, that's clearly spurious and silly on the one hand, right? Motivation matters, and it matters more in certain places as opposed to others. In a legal context, it is obviously very, very important. We're talking about mens rea or criminal intent. But some hypothetical options that I would like to throw out there as thought exercises. So practitioners maybe block your ears for a minute, but just academics, hear me out. Hear me out. Okay. What if we decided, okay, let's just call a spade, and let's stop hiding behind the gray areas between the different disciplines, and just stop talking about motivation as if we somehow have real insight into that. Okay. Now, from a management perspective, from a policy perspective, there are real-world limitations to that very idea. There are obvious real-world implications to knowing if extreme right-wing activity is increasing, if white supremacy has a problem that allows for prioritization of action, allocation of resources, and so on and so forth. But I see some potential benefits from a different perspective. We can actively disavow and discourage the perennial practice of motive mongering every single time an act of targeted violence happens. Because yes, it's relatively short term, but it never leads us anywhere. And I think it probably does us in the field a disservice more than anything else. A second benefit, and again, I'm really talking to the academics on this one, is that it might encourage us to prioritize description over explanation. The funny thing about terrorism studies and studying it for so long is that I think we kind of got it a bit backwards. We put so much effort into developing all of these theories over the last 4 decades that we actually forgot that we might need a very rich body of descriptive material to kind of, inform those theories. We don't need more theories in terrorism research. What we need are the ideographic accounts, the thick descriptions of how people do what they do and the precise sequencing in how they do it and when they do it and where they do it. That's what we need. Those are the kinds of things that crack the radicalization to mobilization issue. It's the sequencing of those events. How and why people get involved in terrorism, that stuff stopped being a mystery years ago. What we have trouble figuring out, like I said, is the precise sequencing and whether that differs from group to group, whether that differs from within different cohorts in the same group and so on and so forth. And again, an added benefit is that we prioritize prevention efforts by not tying it to issues of motivation and by extension, ideology. This is one of my favorite quotes that I accidentally dug up when I reread this article. I know we have one of the co-authors right here in the room. Completely unintentional, I promise you. 10 years ago, I might have looked at your quote and been sort of, I might have been a little bit depressed about it, and I might have said, you know, that's a bit unfair. But now I look at it and I think it's absolutely spot on. I agree 100%. In all honesty, no one, not even experts in terrorism, can say for sure when someone actually poses the threat until the point at which the individual engages in concrete activities. The one area, however, in which I have become a bit more optimistic is in, and not to put words in your mouth here, is in this final part, the point at which the individual engages in concrete activities. I'm not talking about the point at which an individual detonates a bomb. I'm talking about the point in which a person says to friends, family, or coworkers, not just here's my grievance, and here's how I feel about it, but on Friday, I'm going to go down there and do something. All of the pontificating and navel-gazing about ideology in the world isn't going to bring us any closer to figuring out how to better make that known. You know, you want to talk about bystander issues, talk to Michelle Grossman. But it seems to me that if we are serious about being in the business of primary prevention, these are the things, this is where we need to retain our focus. Now, again, you know, might seem a little bit disingenuous that I'm not trying to deliberately create silos of activity here, but this is where we need to retain our focus. I'm all for fresh thinking. I mean, there are clearly changes taking place in terrorism all the time. And of course, we ought to be paying attention to that. Of course, we ought to be figuring out whether it's real, what it means for us, but we shouldn't lose sight of where we are making real progress right now. And it seems to me that this is one of the areas where I've seen some of the most exciting research over the past 20 years develop. And finding ways to make reporting convenient is, I think, where we're seeing so much progress. Or, you know, are you familiar with the expression, not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Yeah, okay. Or, okay, if we're going to continue to talk about motivation, then can we at least figure out a better way of talking about it, right? And I promise this is not some sort of like academic preciousness on my part. I'm saying be explicit about what we're talking about. One of the reasons there's so much dissatisfaction with models and analogies in the terrorism field is that, you know, they're convenient and they're very memorable. I mean, we have analogies, different kinds of analogies to help us simplify what is a very, very complex problem, but they're very vague when it comes to, well, is this about, are you explaining this process? Are you trying to, you know, is there some predictive capacity here? How can we find better ways to talk and think about motivation? This is not to say that this is the answer, but I think this might be one answer, certainly for people involved in psychological research. You know, if we're talking about motivation, we're essentially talking about a moving cause. My mentor, Max Taylor, has said for decades and decades, I'm really aging him now, but Max, you know, adopt very much a rational choice perspective from criminology. And he would say, the reasons people become involved in terrorism in the first place can be explained by one set of factors, but the reasons why someone might progress to engaging in a terrorist act are going to have to be explained in a different way. So we got two different explanations here, two different levels of activities. We can begin to disaggregate these phases if we take a far more explicit approach to operationalizing motivation. And we're talking about learning, we're talking about performance, we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about optimization, we're talking about how people progress from being amateur terrorists to professional terrorists, how they cope with the day-to-day demands of involvement, and all of those sorts of things. But the idea that there could be one sort of explanation for all of this process is bananas. It always has been, and I don't know why we just don't make it explicit, because we're not going to get anywhere if we have this rather wishy-washy concept of motivation, because it is it's spurious, it's vague, and it is getting us nowhere. Another benefit to this is that we get to distribute it. There's no way that one discipline can answer, can address all of these issues as well. Part 3, and here's where I will begin to wrap up, and thank you for indulging me in this flight of fancy. We have another set of contradictions here. More than ever before, and again, this is one of the ways in which the study of terrorism has really fundamentally changed over the past 10 to 15 years. More than ever before, we have access to what terrorists say and think about themselves, about others, about what they do, and, disturbingly, how they do it. The irony is that it doesn't necessarily bring us any closer into deciphering their motivational processes. And those of you familiar with some of my earlier work and some of the work by Max Taylor and others, you know that I've said this many, many times before. I've almost given up on saying it, but I decided to make the most of my COVID journey and write a book about it. Our bottleneck in this research is that we could spend all day long studying manifestos. We can spend all day long looking at online activity. We will never get to where we need to get unless we can get access to former terrorists. I don't know what kinds of experiences you've had in Australia with this. I know that some of my colleagues in Europe are finally starting to make some breakthroughs here. I've been working very closely with the FBI's BAU1 to argue that, okay, if you cannot get us into the Federal Bureau of Prisons, then let us work with you to develop tools to allow you to collect this data. Because go back to Patrick Crusius's statement, the one thing that he really wants to drive home, my motives are not at all personal. It's nonsense. Just because he doesn't want to tell us what might be going on, because perhaps it might reduce the sense of importance, a sense of the noble righteousness associated with this cause. But personal motivations are critical. We have to do this, and it surprises me. And again, it's just maybe my naivete speaking, shining through here. But when I see high-profile academics writing, otherwise terrific books, but Qasim Qassam recently, I think, really grossly mischaracterized psychology and says psychological studies are not necessarily a better guide to the extremist mindset than novel, American, pastoral, or other works of fiction. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with him about the comparison here. What I have a problem with is this notion of the extremist mindset, because I think for me it sort of implies a static quality. Well, if there's one thing we know about the consequences of getting involved in terrorism is that it changes you. It changes you, you change it. People change and develop as a result. But this idea of a mindset is just rooted in a set of rather static assumptions about people. So like I've said, how people become involved is no longer a mystery. We know what the constellation of what do we call them, risk factors, big issues, little issues, public reasons, private reasons. We've done a very good job collectively of figuring out what those are. How they all fit together is that's another issue. That's the kind of thing we need to validate and verify with access to first-hand accounts. What we absolutely need, and I will not be saying this in 10 years' time, because if I have to say it in 10 years' time, I will be long gone from this field. This needs to happen. We need systematic interviewing of incarcerated offenders. And it can, it needs to cover everything from I call it the entire arc of involvement, a phrase borrowed from my colleague Emma Barrett in the UK, involvement, engagement, disengagement, the entire arc. Back in the late 1970s, the FBI did this in a not terribly scientific study with 36 serial killers. But what that study led to was a profound change in the way we think about how offenders do what they do. There are currently at least 650 individuals incarcerated in American prisons for terrorist offenses. Think of what we could do with access to only a fraction of them. It would revolutionize research on terrorist psychology, and I think it would have great benefits for how we think about prevention writ large. It would certainly allow us to also address a lot of the issues that the methodologists among us will say time and time again. Okay, fine, you managed to go interview 10 or 20 terrorist offenders. Whoopie-doo. Where's your control group? Well, sure, okay. I mean, that's not a reason for us not doing it, but prison offers a kind of environment where we can engage in these types of comparisons. We can begin to move from what are merely hypothetical conjectures about the differences between offenders to making real comparisons. So let me conclude. Let me wrap up with this by saying that again, I'm just full of contradictions today, but I'm just struggling with how to reconcile this. We've made so much progress in terrorism studies. The fact that we are all on the same page with just how complex this is, I mean, that for me, folks, that's the win. That is the real win, because that is giving us all pause for, you know, making very, very careful statements or recommendations about what to do. Why would any of us deny, or why would any of us rather, you know, be jealous of the job of a practitioner when it comes to counterterrorism? Because primary prevention, it seems to me, is the hardest thing you could possibly do in this space. Tertiary prevention is much easier. I'm not saying de-radicalization is necessarily effective, but the fact that the recidivism rate is next to zero, irrespective of whether people are, you know, engage in DRAD programs or not. Well, I'm not saying you should only rely on that, but even if you do nothing, for reasons we do not understand, the recidivism rate is next to nothing. But primary prevention remains utterly difficult. Is terrorist motivation a meaningful concept? I contend that it is not. And as a result, I don't think we have the language, I don't think we have the means to properly understand terrorism today. Let me finish with something a bit more self-serving, which is that to try to make sure that, you know, this isn't just some sort of intellectual hobby horse of mine or my colleague Matt Taylor. We put out a call for papers in our journal, Terrorism and Political Violence, and we want your input from, you know, irrespective of what your discipline is or what your interest is in terrorist motivation. But we put the call for papers up, and we would love you to reach out to us. Please consider submitting an abstract for consideration. We are accepting proposals up until the end of this month. If you come to me today and say, I really want to get something in there, but it might take a few extra days, then let's have a conversation. But we want to open up this discussion, and we want to figure out, can we move the needle? Terrorism, like I said, it is always changing. It is always complex. That is never, ever going to stop. But we need to make some course corrections in real time if we are going to be able to say something meaningful about what those changes actually entail. Fluid ideologies, ideological promiscuity, it is an issue, it is a trend. I don't think it's that we're just recognizing it, but I am not convinced that the implications of it are as significant as we think. So how about I stop there, and if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, food to throw at me, please fire away. Thank you.
I'm glad you didn't give us anything to think about. That was a truly wonderful, inspiring, provocative keynote, John, one that I want to argue with you about for probably 7 or 8 hours. So, but in favor of the audience, look, we have about 12 minutes for Q&A now. Don't be shy. Feel free to put your hand up. Let's start here. Kelly.
Hi, John. Thank you. That was fabulous. We're so excited that you're here. My question, I guess in this space, we know that definitions are always an issue and something that we always have to start with. But is it potentially a matter of defining what we mean by motivation? Because potentially are we talking about beliefs, when we talk about it not being important to focus on ideology, that we're not focusing on an individual's beliefs, but we are potentially focusing on them. You said, in terms of the quote you used when he said that motivation was not personal, he said it is very personal. And so is that really defining what motivation is? Is it around defining that motivation is what is that individual seeking? Are they seeking personal glory? Are they seeking to be involved with others? So is it a matter of, I think, motivation actually being very important, but us making a difference in how we define what motivation is?
Thank you for the question. I would be willing to meet you halfway on that if you are willing to be very explicit about what you mean by motivation. So my point is, it all matters for the individual. So, there is whenever you look at an account of someone's involvement, and especially if they're willing to offer that account firsthand, there's typically a combination of the ideological, the political, the social, the personal. But even the most cooperative interviewees, it strikes me, have difficulty in disentangling what those influences might be. The devil's advocate question is, what do we lose, if anything, by saying, you know what, how about we just put all of that to one side and instead focus on when and where and how you decided you were going to act? Because this is the thing. So remember that one of the third defining element of terrorism is the low base rate of activity. If we focus on ideology, if we even prioritize ideology for a moment, we're going to have so many false positives that we will never be able to detect the signal from the noise. For me, it's not about the ideology, and it never has been. It's about the decision to act. And it's about the leakage, it's about the plans, it's about making preparations, it's about target scouting, it's about telling friends, family, coworkers, I'm fed up talking about it, I want to do something. So I know, I hear you, and I know, and it's a big ask, I get it. I just don't see what the benefit of retaining the focus on ideology is.
I'm going to go to Malcolm and then Manas. Malcolm is up there.
Thanks, John. Really great paper. And you actually touched on my question that I had in my mind throughout, which was terrorism studies has become much more sophisticated, and it's gotten somewhere by saying it's complicated. Mm-hmm. But the question of motivation and ideology are written in the law in defining what terrorism is. And while terrorism studies might be more and more nuanced and complex, we've got law enforcement agencies out there who are trying to build a case and evidence that motivation and ideology play a role, and are therefore also building an archive of evidence that researchers might one day want to access as well. But they're driven by proving motivation and ideology. I just don't know if you could say a little bit more about that potential conflict.
Well, the conflict is real, there's no question about it. And that's a conflict that is going to be present or absent depending on the jurisdiction. So, I mean, we don't have the same challenges in the United States, for example, where you can, to an almost limitless degree, say whatever you want. I mean, hate speech, violent rhetoric is it's part of the normal discourse now. So I don't know how we reconcile that. I certainly don't know how we reconcile it across jurisdictions. I just don't know. And so yeah, I mean, fair point. So again, a good example of the tension between terrorism studies versus real world. I think, and if I've given the impression that those should be seen as separate, then that's on me. I didn't mean to do that at all. But it's again one of the one of the thought exercises, I guess, that has been especially valuable in the United States has been, just because someone doesn't get charged with a terrorist offense, does that mean that they're not a terrorist? Well, we don't have, things will change, but we don't have domestic terrorist legislation. From an analytic perspective, it doesn't mean that a person is any less engaged or committed to terrorism. Now, how we reconcile that, I don't know at all.
Thank you, Professor Horgan. My question kind of walks across both the motivation and ideology component. In this ideological promiscuity kind of case, are you seeing any change in how fantastical the goals of individual actors are along with that? Because you might think of, earlier terrorisms of the 60s, 70s, 80s having concrete political goals, whereas as we move more and more towards today, the goals become increasingly less achievable in a real world. Do you think that is that something you've seen in your research?
I don't think the goals, thank you, great question. I don't think that the goals of a terrorist movement necessarily have any bearing on why an individual gets involved with a particular group. Sometimes there's overlap, but 9 times out of 10, I don't see it. I don't know that the goals have become less realistic. I mean, there was a point in time where, now it's seen as the gospel truth that it's going to happen, but there was a point in time when a united Ireland seemed like a completely nonsensical, fanciful idea. And there was a point in time when the idea of a global caliphate didn't seem any less realistic to the most ardent of believers in the Islamic State project, for example. But I see the same, I think it's a matter of inconsistency, quite frankly. And I see the same logic creeping back into discussions around violent incels, where this idea of recreating or dreaming of a fantasy society where sex is equally distributed among all males. I mean, it's of course it's nonsensical. Of course it's risible. We laugh at it, but it doesn't mean it's any less significant for a committed violent incel.
I know Matteo had his hand up. I'm going to ask my own question to intervene here just for a moment. So I'm finding myself reluctantly moving towards your idea about why motivation might be less important, and particularly the role of ideology. But I think my question at the moment is, because I'm thinking about Michael Stoll's very, very astute point that all terrorism is a communicative act on some level. If you take ideas out of the mix, why is it terrorism? So how does terrorism become distinguished from another kind of violent crime type if the role of ideas and the role of intent doesn't feature somewhere? The motivation part, I think I agree with you that it should not be more important or the chief, but is the ideology piece of this, can we so easily afford to dismiss, and are we thinking about ideology when we should actually be talking about ideas? Because you've used both terms, and I'm very intrigued about the interplay.
I'll be a total contrarian and give it an answer again. I think we should be talking about grievance. I think the grievance is finding root in the idea. The grievance is finding root in the ideology. I think it is all about the grievance, and I think the ideology hopping is about finding the convenient outlet for the grievance and the expression of that grievance. The ideology is what normalizes it. I think it can play a role in helping someone, walk over the edge in terms of deciding, okay, I put it off for long enough, I'm going to do it now. And the ideology is the vehicle for that. But I think it is a facilitator. It is absolutely not the driving factor. It's not the motivator at all.
And we are now in complete accord.
Okay.
Matteo.
Thanks, Misha. Thank you, John. My question was about how much you think we can take from the hate crime literature and experience in identifying motivation. Like, it's from the 90s, the hate crime practice and the theory. They have been looking at bias indicators, which basically are ideology indicators in a way, or let's say the discriminatory selection model in which you look at the difference between the offender and the target group. So how much do you think we can use this? approaches?
Short answer is I don't know. The slightly longer answer is, I'm a pragmatist. Whatever works, it doesn't matter. I think what will remain the same, however, is that we know what the factors are at this point. I mean, that's how good the research on terrorism has become over the last 10 to 15 years. There's been so much good data mining done that we know what the constellation of influences that drive action are. We still don't know what the sequencing is for this, whether it's, we call it the radicalization to mobilization process or whatever, the psychology of terrorism. We can make all the comparisons in the world, whether it's, bias crimes, gangs, David Pyrus and Scott Decker made the most convincing argument about why we should finally follow through with those comparisons. But unless we can validate the accounts and validate the risk factors with access to individuals, we will never know. So I don't want you to think I'm sort of, again, skirting around the issue here, but the challenge, I think, and what I'm trying to lay out here is that we need to do 3 or 4 things at the same time if we're going to be able to really make the breakthrough here. And I don't know that we're capable of doing it.
Okay. On that note of promise, unfortunately, we have to close the session now. John, thank you again. That was truly a wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.